baseball started yesterday, if you're a big baseball fan. Music, movies, clothing, all these kinds of things are much more in play when we get to this modern half of the survey. So if you're interested, I mean, again, these are all books I've assigned in class before. Meaning of sports, fandom, if you're interested in fandom in general, and I'll get a reference to that in just a second, is one of the hottest topics of why people are engaged in materials that are either online or fan activities, Game of Thrones, online stuff. And the last one is in regards to the way in which sports, in particular, kind of act as a surrogate for participation. You're not an American, you're a Cowboys fan. You're not, you see yourself through the lens of that. And I always like to point out, again, these are my pop culture class. I'll definitely do that. But if you're interested in online gaming, BAFTA just announced its awards, and I don't know why I'm in Bing for some reason. And Microsoft will pull this up. If you Google the BAFTA awards in Bing or in Microsoft or in Google, excuse me, or Mozilla, you'll come up with a list of them. But online gaming is huge, and just gaming in general is huge as a cultural expression. And I say this not because we're going to have a lecture on online gaming or Halo or whatnot, but rather the fact that these are meaningful historical contributions in the modern era. Less so, as a cultural historian, I'm less worried about, whether Lincoln was a Cubs fan or not. Just didn't seem to have the same effect, but it does now. And so you'll see a lot more reference today and later in terms of the cultural stuff. So just FYI, now it kind of floats people's boat one way or the other. Okay, exams. So we're done with all the exams and makeups and whatnot, saying the deal. Pull this out. The average for the third exam was better than the second, and the second was better than the first. So you guys have done what you need to do in regards to being able to maximize this. I won't spend a lot of time going through the material, but these were some of the terms that you guys answered repeatedly and may have missed a point or two for. The Tet Offensive was really a moment in '68 when the American public lost credibility in America's leadership in the war. And so that was, you'll see a credibility gap as a comment there. Containment and NSC 68 are two very different policies. They're not just, we're going to contain, containment is containing. Two very different policies, and just something about the nature of the first one comes out in '45, the second one comes out 5 years later, much more aggressive. So it's NSC 68 if you answer the Vietnam question. NSC 68 is what gets us. Executive Order 8802, largely you'll see good war, question mark. The reason why the Executive Order 8802 is promulgated is because of the war, is because of the idea that the United States is having to deal with racial segregation, racial ideology, et cetera, et cetera. And then the World War II question, I won't get, that central question of the good war was the central theme that I focused on. And again, I made the point of saying the fact that someone gets a job because the economy improves, or the fact that is not worth 60 million human beings dying violent deaths, right? You look at Ukraine today. Oh well, I'm going to get a job, and you have outrage, and people get blown up in trains. That's not a logical answer. What is a logical answer is saying, in essence, that the war forces the United States to change its behavior. If it wants to continue to be the country that we are, we become much less isolationist. We look around the world and say, we are a major player and have a responsibility to push forward our values. What are those values? For freedoms, et cetera, et cetera. And the stuff at home, and I generally took a wide variety of answers, right? But the stuff at home changes the way in which the United States kind of sees itself. Physically moving around, there's civil rights activities, et cetera, et cetera. So you did really well on that, but those were the kinds of, not problems, but why is it a good war, right? What makes it a good war? Why is Captain America different than Iron Man? Had a good book on that, by the way. The Marvel Universe. Captain America is a World War II symbol of the United States. Iron Man is a post-9/11 symbol of the United States. There's a very different kind of style of life to it. Okay, so again, from my perspective, look at the numbers overall, it's really good. As I say to people, one grade on one, I didn't do 4 essay or 4 IDs or something like that is not going to determine your term grade. final exam is still waiting, and et cetera, but generally, I was really happy with the way this class kind of went. So you know the rules, look at that, should make sure my math is correct. If I give you a little extra, then take it and run. Again, a lot of times I'll have somebody, the number will work out to be 69.5, I'll just make it a 70, right? Because it will bother you, and it doesn't matter whatsoever in the long-term scheme of things. But same thing is true, I'll push the button and open these grades up on Blackboard today. If there's a problem that works against you, make sure and let me know. That figures the work program. Okay. And again, the final is not going to be comprehensive, so you start forgetting everything you've learned about World War II now. All right, what else do I got? The papers are due today. I was looking online, and it looks like everybody's figured out how to turn those in. When I grade those, I'll do them individually, sequentially, so some people will have a grade posted before somebody else. Doesn't know how much Will Tiger Woods does, whether they get work done on Sunday. But for the most part, those are really straightforward, and I'll kind of grade them accordingly. Basically, that's all I've got in regards to the course material that you've already done. What we've been talking about, what I'm trying to introduce, is this concept, which, again, I could be wrong, but in the grand history of the United States, when you look at the 20th century, the two topics that are almost guaranteed to have lasting importance to the United States are World War II, and then this topic, the modern civil rights movement. And what I was trying to establish with that kind of introductory, you're not who you say, I'm not who you say, and you're not who you think you are, is to understand what the modern civil rights movement is asking the country to do. And that is to come to some realization that its previous history of race and racism and segregation and et cetera have long-term consequences. And here we are in 2022 with all this, you can't teach this, you can't teach that. It's analogous to someone who's been a domestic abuser saying, well, we'll deal with the domestic abuse, but you can't talk about how many times I beat my wife and beat my kids, right? There's a history to this. And the idea is that one of the things that I talk, the Chris Rock clip, is not to go, these people are good and these people are bad. The guy who wants to keep the street, this way, and the guy who's willing to change the name of the street. It's how invested they are in having control over those kinds of questions. Of saying, in essence, no, this is not a relevant question, or this is a relevant question. Whether it's named Tupac Shakur Boulevard or not is idiocy. Who cares, right? It's the humor that Chris Rock is trying to go for. And in essence, what I concluded with was kind of saying, when you look at the history of the United States, you don't have to look far, right, to see the long-term consequences of racial ideology. We have a very strong history of that, and combating that is not something that just happens overnight. It happens in large part because the United States is forced to come to terms with this new kind of perspective. And World War II is one of the biggest reasons for this, because we're fighting an ideological war against a society, all those people marching around with Nazi flags are saying, in essence, we want racial separation. We want a society that is going to have different legal systems for different people. Those are significant questions. And as I mentioned, you kind of picked up, is that what you're looking at here before 1954, why 54? Because there's a Supreme Court ruling. What you have here is a completely separate legal system. The Constitution means different things to different people depending on the color of their skin. And that means it's a worthless document. If it's not enforced for everyone, if it's not a universal document for every American citizen, then don't call it such, right? Don't pretend it. Don't hand on the heart and all that kind of stuff and say the United States is committed to freedom when it's obviously not, right? So these are difficult issues, but they're also issues, as I'll point out, come back to, that the United States has been dealing with. And I want to make sure and kind of lead in with the positive. If you think the world, look around this class, if you think the world is going to look more like this class and less like a whole bunch of old white guys, right? You're probably correct. That's the way the world looks, and that's the way the world is going to look. The United States has been trying to deal with this now for 70 years. You look at a country like China, People's Republic of China, there's racism all around the world. Humans are humans. And their society has never dealt with this issue. So it's a question of, the reason why you deal with it is because first of all, it's moral and ethical in terms of our Constitution, but it also gives us an advantage. It gives us a sense of saying we've been dealing with this on a national level very publicly, And yet you've got contemporary, no, we're gonna hide it, we're not gonna talk about it, no one can mention it, right? You know, I'm a white tutor, but no recognition of the historical reality of that. Concluded with saying what changes, and I mentioned, you've got this sense of kind of progressive activism, that the world is the way it is because of people, because of institutions that we have. The Second World War, don't need to consider that. Grassroots activism, what I mean by that is that you're not gonna see presidents and congressmen taking the lead here. We'll get to John Kennedy when we get to John Kennedy, but his legacy is sure as hell isn't civil rights reform, right? Because there's too much politically at stake. And lastly, I think I concluded by saying, 3 cheers for capitalism in this sense that what economic success does is to minimize the barriers to a lot of this economic opportunity. And as a result, what you see in the African American population, and quite honestly, as we'll get to in some of these statistics, in all populations, is that their ability to use capitalism to say, hey, listen, I'm successful, I'm as good as you are, I have just as many opportunities as anyone else. And all of these are kind of combining in the post-World War II era. The question remains, big question, History 13, how do you get the majority to willingly cede control? How do you get a majority who already has these social practices, right, of calling an adult African-American man boy, right, of pulling someone over because they are driving while black, right? How do you get a society to change that way? You can change the laws, but if the laws aren't enforced, then who cares, right? You can change the economic opportunity, right, in terms of what is equal and what isn't equal, but again, that's only paper thin. Popular culture is important, but it doesn't change the laws. And then this last point about morality, about what's do the right thing kind of aspect, only has so much limited capability. It is going to be very effective under someone like Martin Luther King or Hector B. Garcia. We live in a different world anymore. Moral suasion doesn't work anymore, right? Moral suasion gets turned into cancel culture, right? I beat my wife and he's trying to cancel me. Right? No, we just want you to stop beating your wife, right? That kind of. What are the different approaches as we're going to see about the regional approach to civil rights? There's a very distinct difference between South and North. It may surprise you, but Southern segregation is a lot less physically. A lot of poor whites and poor blacks are intermixed. They go to school together. That's not the way it is up north. Right? It certainly wasn't in the 40s and 50s. So there's a lot of economic segregation taking place in the north. And how does, and you'll see this shorthand, modern civil rights movement succeed and where does it fail, right? So there's a lot to deal with here in the political narrative. The biggest one is that first question, how? How do you make this transformation stick? And here's where you get to kind of the ends justifying the means, those two distinctions. The goal of the civil rights movement is to ensure legal equality. It's not to cut a check. It's not to make sure someone gets into a college where somebody else doesn't. It's to make sure that the laws apply to everyone equally, right? George Floyd may have broken the law. If that's the case, then you give him a fair trial, trial by jury, whatever, and you process that person through the legal system just like they would process me, a old white guy, right? They sure as hell wouldn't put a knee on my neck for 7 minutes and choke me to death, right? That's the distinction is right there. So legal desegregation is the first way in which a lot of these reformers are looking and saying you cannot have a separate rule of laws. You cannot have a separate system in society because all it does is reinforce this bias of saying, well, because my skin is just a little bit pinkier than someone else's, I get the following rules applied to me. Addressing the cost of racism, what does this mean long term? Right? How are the school systems? What's the medical situation? How are children cared for? Right? What scenarios exist? What are the long-term consequences of this? We're going to see this by the time we get to the 1980s. In large part, the inner cities, places that once housed all the white people, are now going to be concentrated by people of color and particularly poor people, and they are simply forgotten. Right? And just simply, hey, off you go. I mentioned last time, that's where hip-hop comes from. Hip-hop is in essence an artistic statement that says, you may think I'm gone, but I'm not. And here's what I'm saying about it. Right? And so there is this kind of cultural reaction to it. But eliminating race as a meaningful social distinction is the means to avoiding prejudice and inequality. So in essence, making that concept of race exactly what it is, a bias, a bigot, right? You may be a Cowboys fan, a Bears fan, right? That does not mean anything in terms of how you're gonna be graded, how you're gonna be evaluated, how you're gonna get a job, et cetera, et cetera. Those are cultural practices. And make no mistake, there's no laws written that says you can't be a bigot. You can have your personal views, you're not coming to my house, but you have all the kind of personal views you want, right? You still have the freedom to have those values, have those ideals. What you cannot do is use your Cowboys fandom to work against someone else, your own personal value system as somehow meaningful distinction between one person and another, right? So again, meaningful questions, the ones that we're gonna kind of unpack here. That first goal of legal equality is the one that you're going to see the most active in the period immediately following the war. Right? So this is Thurgood Marshall. He's eventually going to be a Supreme Court justice. He is working for the NAACP in something called the Legal Defense Fund. Right? So if you come into my office today, 2022, and you're like, "Hey, listen, Blanky, you graded me this. This. You said this is, I missed this on this question, and you graded me down 20 points. What's up with that?" And I look at you and go, "Well, I don't like you. You're a young white male, right? I don't like that, and I'm going to grade every young white male 20 points off, or because I don't know why, right? Because I'm an asshole, right? Whatever. I'm going to grade." What would you do, right? You have recourse. First of all, you'd go to the provost office. "Oh, this is bullshit. What is he trying to do?" You could go to the state of Texas, and the state of Texas would gladly pick up that court case. You go to the United States Department of Justice, and they would take up that court case. That's what public defense is all about. There's nothing doing that during this period of time. State of Texas, city of Corpus Christi, or Chicago, wherever, New York City, they're doing this through private funds, right? So imagine if something like that happened today and the state would say, "Well, too bad, I know you're an American citizen, but we're not gonna defend you," right? These are private funds. What are they using these meager resources, because you only have so much money to do? They're focusing their efforts not at trying, well, I'll show you in a second, not at trying to directly challenge the constitutional law, but to chip away at the way in which that constitutional law is going to be interpreted. Very busy slide. A lot of people go into law school. If you go to law school, you'll learn all these court cases and their meaning. The simple component of this is 1, 2, 3. How are these lawyers going to do it? One of them is to gradually, slowly chip away at the influence of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson says it's okay to segregate because that's how society is and we can't stop that. Well, it also says in very specific detail that you can't, or you're allowed to segregate railroad cars in the state of Louisiana. And if you can chip away at that, so that's the only thing that Plessy versus Ferguson is going to do, what you've done is effectively neutered the law. You've made it so that it's impossible for this law to be a broad brush to be used on everything. These court cases here are dealing with voting rights, housing segregation, all-white primaries in Texas. They're slowly chipping away at the influence of segregation. The problem is that justice delayed is justice denied. If you're someone who is denied entry to school, or you're someone who's spending time in a court or in prison because you didn't have a trial by jury of your peers, your life is going to be directly affected by that. So this gradualist approach is effective, but it's slow, right? Thurgood Marshall is taking these court cases, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is taking these court cases and slowly making it so that Plessy versus Ferguson is only applied in a very specific way, right? The analogy today is probably best compared to the abortion issue. And abortion is obviously a contentious issue in America. It's ruled Roe v. Wade. Part of what those who are opposed to abortion are doing is trying to chip away at the expansive notion of Roe v. Wade. So they're following the same model, right? And it takes time. A second approach is to go after, and I'll stress this, education. Why education? Because education is a model that most Americans see as the path of individual achievement. You're the one who responds as to whether or not you go to school or not. You're the one who decides whether you get up and go to class, right? Whether you want to do other things, right, and whatnot. You're the one who turns in the papers and studies for the exam. You should be rewarded for that. And what the, again, NAACP Legal Defense Fund is going to do is going to be finding cases And in particular, the University of North Carolina, University of Maryland, Gaines versus Canada in Missouri. These are all very talented students, African American students, who are denied entry into the state's only professional law school, only professional medical school, only professional dental school. They don't have an equal. They don't have a separate but equal opportunity. And saying, in essence, here is someone who has controlled their impulses, has studied hard, is very meritocracy, very much based on your personal work ethic. And they should not be punished as a result of this. Again, these special cases are focused on education because education matters to most Americans. We value it. We look at it and say, you know what? Someone who gets a college degree, no matter what your GPA is, someone who gets a college degree has overcome a ton of obstructions and hard, things that get in your way, but you've accomplished it. You've been able to manage your way through 4 years or 5 years or 6 years or however many years it takes, right? To be able to accomplish this goal that not many people are able to do. We value that as a society. The direct assault on Plessy, the third one, is to go right at the court case and to say, in essence, well, this is poorly worded, poorly reasoned, poorly argued. Every time that happens, the Supreme Court rejects the case. They say, in essence, that there's precedent and we're not going to overturn precedent. When I make reference to the court, particularly the Supreme Court, it is conservative. The meaning of the term, which we'll get to before we talk about the 60s. Conservative actually means something, not how you would see it today. Conservative means that you have to have a damn good reason to change something. And court cases are particularly strong in conservatism. You don't want to have the American public think, well, murder is illegal today, but it may change tomorrow. Right now, murder is still going to be seen in a very. So the court wants to preserve this idea that the final word on something is the final word on something. The difference is that there's minority rulings in court cases, and so you get to Roe v. Wade 6 versus 3. If you can get 2 more votes, you could overturn Roe v. Wade. So if they're not unanimous, usually they're open to discussion. These approaches are all going to be focused on taking one's time, working through the legal process, behind the scenes, right? We're much more interested in opening day of baseball than what's being argued in front of the Supreme Court. And it doesn't really drive or push the needle in regards to America's awareness of this, right? What's taking place at the same time, the reason why I'm bringing in all these books, is because American popular culture, the things that people do in their lives, right? Whether you like to cook or sew or fish or hunt or watch baseball or do whatever, or music, right? The things that give you meaning, the things that give you a sense, these are becoming much more important in a consumer world. Remember back in the Gilded Age, and I was like, remember these weird people, they all like their work, right? They were all producers, they define themselves by their production. We don't do that anymore. We define ourselves, not every industry, some still do, but we define ourselves through our consumption. The truck I own, the clothes I wear, the music I listen to, those elements are all more important in defining ourselves. And so these cultural moments are going to increasingly be laying bare this idea that Marian Anderson, who's standing right here singing at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Marian Anderson was considered the world's greatest alto soprano opera singer. Now I couldn't tell you, but it was a good opera, don't know until the fat lady sings kind of argument. She goes to Europe, there's a tour, this is before World War II. Everyone in Europe is gaga, this woman is phenomenal, she's an amazing voice. She is slated to give a performance when she returns to the United States in, of all places, Constitutional Hall. The Constitutional Hall has a law in it, the site has a law in the District of Columbia which makes it segregated. This woman, this best singer on the planet, cannot even sing in Constitutional Hall. Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, is going to take this up and say it's an affront going into World War II, right? Nazis and racial policy and all the final solution. But the United States needs to be aware of this. And Eleanor Roosevelt basically stages a public concert. And she decides to stage it at the Lincoln Memorial. It's the first time the Lincoln Memorial has been used that way. Lincoln Memorial hasn't been here forever. I don't remember, it's like 1922, 23, so it's a relatively new memorial. And it becomes this rallying point. The reason why Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech there is because of this reference. And it's drawing to a kind of a focus on, you know, these are Americans too. And the idea that somehow they're treated differently under the Constitution is un-American. It doesn't work within the four freedoms. It sure sounds like Nazi Germany. I mentioned last time, in the 50s, you see youth culture emerging and being drawn to rock and roll, rhythm and blues, right? Played by African Americans. The irony is that a lot of white fans of rock and roll had to be in segregated places. They didn't get the best seats because these were African American performers, and those were the ones who was usually slated for African American audiences, and whites had to be in the balconies and all that kind of stuff. But young people are voting with their behavior, as I argued last time. Truman himself is going to be faced with this in 1948, and unlike the don't ask, don't tell of the Clinton years or whatever, you know, let's push it down the road, let's not, you know, get out of the kitchen if you can't stand the heat. Truman picks up his pen and says, listen, I am the commander-in-chief, I am desegregating your army. You don't like it? Too bad, right? So he takes the political heat for that. The Army is, in many regards, still sort of the backbone of, we're 3 years out of World War II, the backbone of the military services and the ways in which people see themselves in their relationship to the military branches, right? The biggest of these, Jackie Robinson, I didn't bring my books in, but Jackie Robinson, there's a hell of a lot of those. Robinson is going to be selected by the Brooklyn Dodgers, right? So again, baseball fans, happy opening day. And Cubs are in first place in the Central, right? 1-0, right? Won't last for long. Yeah, I mean, Branch Rickey is looking around, and if you're a baseball fan, and somebody who likes statistics, because baseball fans love statistics, they're really meaningless before 1940. You have two separate leagues. You have African Americans and you have non-African Americans, right? And you have people who are, they're not playing intermixed. By this point in time, Branch Rickey of the Brooklyn Dodgers is looking around and saying, it is inevitable that Americans are going to want to see the best baseball players, not just simply the whitest baseball players. And he is going to look around for who best to take from the Negro Leagues. There's a number of people you could have used. Satchel Paige is much older. You know, there's a long list of them. Part of the reason why Robinson is selected is because he is an NCAA athlete. He does attend not an all-white school, a mostly white school in UCLA. He has faced kind of the racial opposition in the field. And in essence, what Branch Rickey does is to say, I'm going to take a chance on this kid because I know he's going to react. He's not going to react in the crowds, but he's going to react the way we need someone like this to react. They cannot come in and be seen as a victim. They have to simply turn the cheek and accept it. In many regards, Robinson is going to die early as he has diabetes, but it's also this kind of internalized anxiety that he has. He has 3 heart attacks, for God's sakes, in sort of having to do the Hank Aaron, turn the other cheek, not raise race, etc., in regards to his defeat. But you've got America's pastime. Even his own teammates at first didn't like playing with him, but within a couple of months, most of his teammates are like, he's a baseball player. He runs really well, right? He hits really well. He's someone who's a baseball player. Who gives a shit about what color of skin that she has? And the Brooklyn fans are going to warm to this as well. So performance, not skin tone, is going to be on demonstration here. Once you have the breaking of this color line, it's going to follow in most of the other sports, right? NCAA and professional sports as well, right? So all of this is in the air. And you got World War II as the focus of it. It is going to reach ahead because of this little girl right here, right? Olivia Brown is an 8-year-old young girl from Little Rock, or Topeka, Kansas. This map here is showing her house. There's Oliver Brown, her father's house. One day they get a flyer in the mail, and local Sumner Elementary School, which is right over here, goes door to door and puts flyers out and says, if you have a grade school kid, make sure and bring them down on Saturday and enroll them in school so that they're ready for the fall semester. Oliver, who is a member of the NAACP, right, who is aware of what the Legal Defense Fund is doing. We'll get back to this with Rosa Parks. She ain't just tired. She is tired, but it's not just that. She's aware of what's going on, grassroots. This man in this small neighborhood is going to say, I'm going to bring my daughter to my neighborhood school that I'm paying taxes for. They walk in, whoa, you're black. Oh, hang on. You can't go to school here. You've got to have your 8-year-old walk down the street, cross the railroad tracks, go down what is one of the busiest thoroughfares in the region, and go down to an all-black school, Monroe Elementary. Right? It's one of 3 different court cases that are taking place that the same scenarios apply. So Oliver Brown understands what's going on with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He understands that education has got a magic kind of element to it in American psyche. This is what we look at and say, everyone deserves to be able to do what they can do based on their own hard work and effort. And it goes to the Supreme Court as one of a series of laws. It arrives at the Supreme Court in 1952. It is not adjudicated, meaning it's not ruled on, for 2 years. Why? Because the Supreme Court recognized that this does all those things that we were talking about in terms of their approaches. It is a direct assault on Plessy. It is focused on mass education, so public grade schools, and not private. You can still have segregated private. If you want, can't stand pigments, you can go wherever you want to in the private sector, right? And that freedom is still there, hasn't been canceled. And it connects that notion of sort of incrementalism. They recognize it as the watershed case of the century. One aging justice is going to oppose this. When he dies, and the Republican, relatively conservative president, Dwight Eisenhower, selects a Republican governor of California, Earl Warren, as the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, there's no discussion, but it is understood there's going to be a unanimous decision on this. Either we are a apartheid country that has 2 separate legal systems, 2 separate worlds based on skin tone, or we are going to support this. And so what Warren does is to hold this in limbo, effectively, in discussion, until there is a unanimous decision. There is no dissent. There's no one on the court saying, here's an alternative reading to this, where you could look at Roe v. Wade and see 3 examples of that. Right? You see the new justice just nominated. She's in the minority, but what you will have is her rulings that are going to be part of the historical legacy. Here's why I disagree. Here's why I agree. Right? That perspective is an important one. Right, left, or center, whatever your political situation. By fall of 53, they have achieved this consensus. The only downside of Brown v. Board of Education is that Warren decides to write the opinion. He's not the most flowing of writers, right? He doesn't have the lilting, the high. Does segregation of schools, children solely based on color, even though physical facilities may be equal, provide the minority group equal opportunities? We believe that it does. Boom, right? What this does is overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. This says is that I don't care what your personal values are. I don't care if you really, really, really like the Cubs. I don't care if you really, really, really hate hip-hop music. I don't care. It's got nothing to do with the legal definition of others as citizenship. Your freedoms do not impinge upon someone else's. Right? That's what Brown v. Board says. And all the lawyers are walking around high-fiving, yay, all right. Justifiably so. It's a watershed case. It's a major rule. Right? But as attorneys, they're like, well, this will just work itself out. This will be, America will change overnight because of this court case. Right? It is the first time the 14th Amendment is going to be enabled, by the way. Meaning it's the first time there's teeth put in behind the 14th Amendment, which, if you go way back, right, was almost at the start of this class. During the same period of time, and it should be noted, right, that the same process, I make this point of saying, look at the African American population because of its size. The big issue down here is this last one. The Mexican Americans are making the same argument. Gus Garcia is absolutely brilliant and tragically an alcoholic, right? He's going to die early. If you go, by the way, to San Antonio, his grave, I've been to that gravesite. It's kind of a minor gravesite marker there.